Hey, how you doing? This is Adam Post. College accreditors surrender, tell colleges it's okay now to cancel DEI. From inside higher ed, as colleges face funding threat, accreditors offer flexibility. Accreditors are relaxing enforcement of DEI standards as colleges grasp for answers on what unclear Trump administration directives targeting DEI actually mean. This is extremely significant. Let me tell you why. Because colleges need accreditation. Colleges need accreditation to demonstrate that they meet a certain standard of educational quality, as if diversity, equity, and inclusion was part of their educational quality. Well, the accreditors, the political guys that they are, actually made that happen. It's important for student credibility to have accreditation, credit transferability, employer recognition, and eligibility for federal financial aid. So accreditors, through this backdoor method, were able to force colleges and universities, and even law schools, to accept their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives to receive federal aid. Because if you're not accredited, and it's not supposed to be about ideology, it's supposed to be about literally, is the college or the university, the educational institution, doing a good job? Is it responsible so that you get a degree from somewhere, and the degree is actually worth something, because it's not like some fly-by-night operation. Essentially, it assures potential students and employers that the degree that they are earning is from a legitimate institution with a recognized level of academic rigor. What does diversity, equity, and inclusion policy have to do with educational rigor? With the quality of what you're learning so that you can go on in life and be the professional that you train to be with your actual degree. It has nothing to do with that. And now it's getting stopped. President Donald Trump's broadside against diversity, equity, and inclusion has left colleges scrambling to determine how to comply, even as they juggle accreditation standards containing elements of DEI. But even with an executive order from the Trump administration targeting illegal DEI programs at colleges blocked by the courts, and a Dear Colleague letter from the Education Department, likely unenforceable, although we'll have to see about that, because if it's not that letter getting enforced, the Trump people will find a way to enforce this. DEI has to get out of colleges and universities. Every serious person understands that, and it's going to happen. Accreditors see the writing on the wall. They're treading lightly on DEI, allowing colleges leeway on complying to certain standards. If the accreditors didn't provide such flexibility, colleges would essentially have to decide between complying with the federal government or with their accreditor, a nearly impossible situation for institutions. But it's not that impossible when you get down to it. It's either stick with the federal government or stick with these woke ideological accreditors that have been corrupted. If an institution goes against the federal government, they're going against the people that may not confer direct credibility upon them, but they're not going to give them money. And without money, they don't exist. Some accreditors, like the STEM accreditor, ABET, have dropped DEI standards entirely. And the American Bar Association suspended enforcement of its DEI standards through August, while it weighs revisions to such requirements. And the purposes of those revisions are so they can comply with what the Education Department from the federal government says they are allowed to put in their rules and they're not allowed to put in their rules. But the Education Department is being careful not to put out too much information because all they want is for people to not work around the new rules. They want people to just cut out the nonsense. We all know what diversity, equity, and inclusion means. And yes, it can be vague. And yes, there are ways of cheating around it. And the Education Department of the federal government does not want anyone cheating around it. They just want people to go back to focusing on their professions, teaching students how to function in society, and giving them proper degrees for doing and learning proper work. As colleges feel the squeeze, some of the largest institutional accreditors have decided not to force colleges to choose between them or the Education Department, at least for now, largely telling institutions they will not be adversely affected if they fail to comply with DEI standards due to state or federal laws. While accreditors allow colleges to operate with flexibility on DEI standards, some are also pushing back on the Trump administration's crackdown, particularly the Dear Colleague letter that seeks to expand a Supreme Court opinion in the Students for Fair Admissions case, which shot down affirmative action, to ban race-conscious scholarships, programming, and more. The accreditors are sad because there's no way that they have enough juice to take on the federal government. Here's what they had to say. Well, we would suggest that the U.S. Department of Education's interpretation of SFFA is overly broad and expansive, a concern shared among legal experts. according to the Council of Regional Accrediting Commissions, who wrote this in a letter to the Trump administration on Monday. Their officials added that the 14-day deadline for colleges to drop all race-conscious activities is unreasonable, and that the expectations for institutional actions, or the methods through which the institutions are expected to comply with these broad-reaching requirements, are unclear. They're right that it's aggressive, and they're right that it's unclear. The message in their letter is essentially stop it immediately, or the federal government is threatening your funding. You're not going to get funded the way you thought you would get funded. At the very least, you're going to have to worry, are we going to get funded or not? A deliberately vague, threatening letter from the people that give you money is ultimate control over the people that get the letter. If you don't need their money, it's not a problem. If you do need their money, it's a really big problem. And in that case, the more threatening, the more demanding, and the more vague, the better. Numerous accreditors also signed on to a letter to the department from the American Council on Education, which raised similar concerns. The letter also noted that, quote, however one defines DEI, and DEI is a concept that means different things to different parties, it's worth noting that the range of activities that are commonly associated with DEI are not, in and of themselves, illegal. At which point the Trump administration gets that letter, laughs, and throws it in the garbage. As accreditors press the Department of Education for clarity, they've also provided guidance to colleges, emphasizing that their member institutions must follow state and federal laws. Quote, what we've said is that they can be assured we would not take any adverse action with regard to any of our standards if the institution is attempting to follow what they believe is a legal requirement, according to Larry Shaw, president of the New England Commission of Higher Education, who told this to Inside Higher Ed. Nicole Beaver, I don't name him, I just read the articles, wrote by email that the organization has notified institutions, quote, that the commission would never expect any institution to violate the laws or government mandates of the jurisdictions in which they operate. She added that their standards, quote, will in no way inhibit institutional compliance with the law. Barbara Gelman-Dandley, president of the Higher Learning Commission, emphasized in an email to Inside Higher Ed that institutions must comply with all members of the regulatory triad comprised of accreditors, state governments, and the Federal Department of Education. If HLC's requirements overlap with the requirements of other members of the triad, so all three of the groups, we work with the other triad members to identify these situations and limit the burden of the institution, she wrote. Quote, HLC does not prescribe how a member institution meets HLC's requirements, she added. If a requirement of another entity of the triad may appear to limit an institution's ability to meet HLC's requirements in a particular manner, an institution has the flexibility within HLC's requirements to identify other ways to demonstrate it meets HLC's requirements. That's not such a clear statement either. In guidance sent to member institutions, Western Association of Schools and Colleges Senior College and University Commission Interim President Christopher Oberg noted that the Dear Colleague letter from the federal government does not have the force of the law and encouraged institutions, quote, to consult their own legal counsel to help navigate the department's guidance. Oberg added that the organization will continue to provide updates to member institutions as matters are clarified. The Accrediting Commission for Community and Junior Colleges has also emphasized flexibility in its guidance to members. Quote, it is important to note that as a federally recognized institutional accreditor, ACCJC would never require a member institution to violate state or federal laws and regulations or consumer protection clauses. As an agency, we're beholden to the federal government, state governments, and our member institutions, and work collaboratively and flexibly with those oversight partners to meet any and all regulations and communicate requirements to member institutions as necessary, according to their president, Mac Powell. Policies on DEI are as varied as the accreditors themselves, with different requirements or none at all. For instance, NECHE's accreditation criteria urge member institutions to address their own goals for the achievement of diversity, equity, and inclusion across the student body, faculty, and staff. But MSCHE's accreditation criteria require institutions to reflect deeply and share results on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of their mission across areas such as goals and actions, demographics, policies, processes, assessments, and resource allocation. But one goal of DEI reflection would be to address disparate impacts on an increasingly diverse student population if discovered. Elsewhere, MSCHE indicates that candidates for accreditation should have sufficient diversity, independence, and expertise to ensure the integrity of the institution. Other accreditors, such as HLC, say that an accredited college should strive, quote, to ensure that the overall composition of its faculty and staff reflects human diversity as appropriate within its mission and for the constituencies it serves. They have more exacting standards, but some accreditors, like the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges, have never included DEI criteria. Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities interim president Jeff Fox told Inside Higher Ed by email that it too has never officially had DEI standards as part of its requirements. Quote, the NWCCU has no language in the standards pertaining to DEI, and it recognizes institutions are addressing the requirements of various state and federal laws in this area. The NWCCU supports institutions in their efforts to address the DCL as appropriate for their circumstances, according to Fox. Some critics, particularly on the conservative side, take a dim view of accreditors' DEI standards. Andrew Gillen, a research fellow at the conservative Cato Institute Center for Educational Freedom, wrote in a recent paper that accreditors too often abuse their power as gatekeepers to federal financial aid, including in areas such as pushing DEI standards. On paper, such standards look fine, he wrote to Inside Higher Ed, but he questions how standards get enforced, arguing that the problem is the interpretation of those standards. Accreditors can and do use vague standards to force radical changes on campus. Gillen pointed to a past conflict in 2000 when he argued the ABA used innocuous and vague diversity requirements to force George Mason University Law School to discriminate in favor of black applicants by simply rejecting anything the university did short of discriminating. But Gillen believes colleges face little risk if they fail to comply with accreditors' DEI standards. Well, colleges are in very little danger so long as they follow federal civil rights laws, which have largely reverted to their original intention of promoting colorblindness, he wrote. Any state or accreditor that requires violating these laws will find itself in a world of legal trouble. Accreditors that ignore civil rights laws would lose their recognition from the Department of Education, and colleges that followed such requirements would also lose access to federal aid programs. Robert Shireman, a senior fellow at the Progressive Century Foundation and a member of the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, which advises the Education Secretary on accreditation, downplays the notion that accreditors' DEI standards are burdensome. Typically, he told Inside Higher Ed, accreditors' DEI requirements are minimal. Such standards tend to focus on inclusivity, but he notes that accreditors are not enforcing any kind of quota. At a recent meeting, he said when asked about changing DEI standards, accreditors indicated that they didn't plan to do so because they feel that there's nothing inappropriate about the approaches that they're taking, and they're holding firm. He added that accreditors recognize schools have to comply with laws, whether those laws are federal or state laws. There's also an outstanding question on how the Trump administration is defining DEI. Quote, DEI has become this undefined term that gets interpreted in certain kinds of ways, Shireman said. In a time of uncertainty, Shireman believes many institutions want to see accreditors hold firm on DEI while they push for Education Department guidance on terminating race-conscious activities and programming. Shireman points to surprise and outrage over what he calls an absurd perversion of civil rights laws that is happening in this administration. He goes on to say, to read civil rights laws as prohibiting a caring approach to providing opportunity is Orwellian and it's not appropriate. I don't think schools support the idea of accreditors caving to a backwards interpretation of civil rights laws. Because only certain races, certain sexual preferences, certain genders are allowed to get fair treatment or equal treatment in this country. You're supposed to discriminate against certain kinds of people. Well, the federal government doesn't believe that. The Supreme Court doesn't believe that. And these accreditors who rely on their credibility being maintained by the federal government are being forced to accept that. That's the new reality. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments below. Always love to see your ideas. Please be sure you are subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you again soon with another story. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.